Hello and welcome to Masters of TESOL. On this show, we're going to talk to Tom Randolph about why lessons bomb. Now, it happens to the best of us. We come out of a class and it just didn't feel like we achieved what we wanted to achieve. There was a kind of a deadness at the end of the class. So we're going to talk about reasons why they bomb, how to avoid it, and we're actually going to give you some hard and fast tips that you can actually use in the classroom. Now, I have a lot more to say on this subject than I usually do because for about 2 years I was a manager of instruction at Berlitz, which some of you may have heard of, which meant that I trained and monitored the new teachers and I also monitored the experienced teachers. So I've seen why lessons maybe don't go as well as was intended. And now into the interview. All right, so we're on now. So
all right. Oh, we're on now. All right.
All right, so who are you?
Is that how we're starting this?
It's an interrogation style interview.
Well, my name is Tom Randolph, and I am a teacher developer at a big university here in Seoul. Fairly famous teacher training program. Offers certification to Korean teachers of English as well as non-native speaker teachers of English prior to graduate study. I'm currently the program coordinator there, where I've been developing the curriculum and working with faculty there for almost 9 years now. That's who I am in this context.
That's right now.
That's right now, but I'm also a man with a dog in his lap.
A very quiet dog.
Yes, yeah. Indeed.
So in total, how long have you been teaching then?
My career began at the tail end of the communist era in communist Poland. So that would have been 1986.
Is that as grim as it sounds?
It is as black and white as it sounds. It is as colorless, as it sounds. But I wouldn't say I would never call those years grim. They were fast. I was there for about 3 years, like most of our listeners, anybody listening to this. I imagine that like them, I didn't plan to continue in the profession or even in communist Poland for the 3 years that I did. But
okay. Today we're thinking about why lessons bomb. The main reasons why lessons bomb. So I think from my experience that one reason is that it's just not planned enough. The pieces don't connect. They are literally just separate pieces of the only thing that connects them is the grammatical point, perhaps.
Okay, sure, yeah. That's certainly one thing. It sounds like we're talking about coming into class, opening a textbook, and moving from exercise A to box B to activity C.
Tab A.
Without much thought about how those three things or all those things might cohere. You know?
Right.
Well, what if we also, if we tie that to an overall premise that we need to remember if we're language teachers, and maybe see if we can connect these two ideas somehow. Okay. Let's remember that the ultimately, and it may sound totally obvious to all of us, as it always did to me. Ultimately, nobody is ever going to learn anything in a classroom, especially a language or how to use a language and get better at it, if they're not actually using the language in a conversation while they are learning. Now, we can go back and unpack that for a minute. In other words, what everything is going to boil down to here, I suspect, is we're going to find as we're talking here that the only thing that really matters is how good the conversation is among the students and the teacher while the learning is going on.
And by good, you mean meaningful or authentic?
Well, that's the challenge, of course, and that's why I'm still learning here 25 years down the road. What does a good conversation look like in a language classroom? That's really what I continue to try to answer as I go along semester and year by year with every new group of students and every new group of teacher trainees. But if we're talking about, if we start from your example your example was not planning enough, right? Not okay. we could say, in rephrasing it in the terms I just stated, we could say, I haven't spent enough time, or this lesson bombed because I didn't spend enough time trying to figure out how my students were going to converse through these various activities.
Right.
So as a result, I came in saying, okay, let's do exercise A. Open your books. You're going to fill in the blanks while I take your answers on the whiteboard or on the blackboard, okay? Number one, you, Susie. What's number one? Blah, 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 blah. Correct. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Number two, Billy. What's blah, 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 right? And that's it. Now, if you ask yourself, who talks like that? What have they actually learned by doing? I don't know. They've learned to respond to what's number one, what's number two. They've learned to connect their what's on the page of their book with what the teacher just told me to do. You know, and meanwhile they're just trying to keep the teacher happy because that's what the teacher wants that, and my job as a student is to keep my teacher happy, right? Well, so we can back up and we can say, if we thought about how that might be a conversation, then keeping the teacher happy might have been participating in a conversation, not about the exercise or about the lesson or something like that. If the teacher had planned enough, if you, let's suppose it was your lesson, Andrew, that bombed, and you said, I didn't plan enough, you know, and you were talking to me about this, and I said, well, let's see, Andrew, what was that exercise about? Well, we were just putting correct past tense verbs into those blanks in the book. And I said, well, did you think about how you might make that interesting or conversational with your students? You know, well, maybe if you'd said, Susie, what's number one? And she'd said, I walked my dog yesterday. Well, that's great. Where do you go from there? Oh, do you have a dog, Susie? I do. And then you can go back and ask him a couple more simple past questions about it. Just have a conversation with him. Yeah, do you walk your dog a lot? Yeah, when was the last time you walked your dog? How many times did you walk your dog yesterday? All of these things. I don't know, just hypothetically, but there you go. Yeah. Conversation.
So some kind of meaningful, that is meaningful to them personally.
Yeah.
That it resembles a conversation.
Right.
Because I think, especially the dialogues that you often see in textbooks, I mean, even the best actor in the world could not read those words in a way that feels like it actually happened.
Isn't it funny how almost all of those dialogues, even to me, still wind up sounding full of sexual innuendo? You know?
But yeah, so it's hard to think that if you're teaching to the textbook, it's hard to think that is encouraging authentic sounding communication in any way, even if they copied it word for word. You're not going to get anything.
Right. Along with what I just said earlier about the only thing that matters is the quality of the conversation, I think part of my satisfaction at my own development of an identity as a TESOL professional, as opposed to dare I say, an unprofessional TESOL professional, is the recognition that controlling that conversation and making it happen is not rocket science, as everyone loves to say, but it is an art. And being able to, and acquiring the skills and the self-confidence and the toolkit to maintain that conversation as opposed to a non-functional, non-communicative back and forth between a teacher and students about expected answers and correct answers and so on, is what is so satisfying about a career in language teaching, just developing that skill. So the other, another way to tackle that same hypothetical example I gave you would have been knowing that if I'd planned my lesson enough, I could have started with modeling simple classroom language like, what did you get for number one, and letting students communicate with each other about their answers to that exercise. It's far more useful even for something so basic as that. Like, okay, Andrew, what did you get for number one? And Andrew will have to say, I got reading aloud a sentence. what about you? And there's the back. I could teach what about you as well. I could model that or whatever, give them that little sample, little dialogue, and they could just work their way through that activity, even if they're total beginners
Right.
or virtual beginners. They could work their way through that whole activity as a communication. Whereas I bet you 99% of us, until we get an awakening, will simply be going, number one, number two, good. Number three, no, somebody else? Yep. Not knowing what kind of damage as well as uselessness we might be propagating on our classrooms, right?
Right. And I think that bad example was a good example of evaluative speech, right?
Yeah.
Saying good, good, good.
Yeah.
That giving that impression that everything you say is being evaluated in some way of correctness.
Absolutely. There is an identity that we all, especially all of us, native speakers, if there were such a thing, and non-native speakers alike, there's an identity that until we know any better, we almost feel obligated to assume we're supposed to be the expert, even if we don't know what the heck we're talking about.
Right.
We're supposed to be the expert. Our students expect us to be the expert. Our institutions expect us to be a language expert. And let's be honest, how many of us, especially us folks who were lucky enough to be born and enculturated into English, really knew what the heck we were talking about the first time we walked into a language classroom?
Oh, I'm embarrassed now thinking back about some of the answers I gave.
Right.
To
And all those answers that go, we say this, or we don't talk like that. We don't do it like that. What kind of talk is that? What kind of explanations are those? And yet we still feel like we're supposed to say, good, okay, excellent. Yes, that's correct. Oh, no, not quite. Nope, that's not it. We think that that's supposed to be part of our conversation. And yet, if your student tells you that they walked their dog yesterday, and your response is, very good. And what did you do yesterday to somebody else? What kind of a response is that? What kind of practice does that afford your student? What kind of real communicative experience does that? You really do. It's amazing how much we need to ask ourselves. How much do our classroom conversations resemble real life conversations? Good Lord, if the stuff we say to our students was repeated by me to my wife, I'd be divorced tomorrow. Very good, honey. Good. Correct. No, not like that.
One of the best pieces of advice I ever got was, and unfortunately I didn't get it until about 8 months into teaching, having had basically no training, was one of the teachers told me to plan backwards. So your first thought would be, when the students leave this classroom, what should they be able to do? Therefore, what is the production? Therefore, what is the practice? Therefore, and so on, working back. What do you need to introduce?
Yeah, it sounds
all the way back to schema.
Yeah, there you go. That's to schema activation, right? That sounds like great advice. And it doesn't sound 8 months into your career. It doesn't sound like it was too late either. That's probably okay.
Well, it was a long 8 months of struggling for a production. That was the problem.
Long 8 months of what the heck am I doing every day?
I was like, what do I do after this practice?
They're going to pull back the veil and discover that I don't know what I'm talking about or doing. Right.
I have to pull off my mask and reveal the face.
Well, that's an interesting. That's an interesting point if we're thinking about why lessons bomb, because in TESOL speak, one of the ways you could rephrase what you were just talking about, of course, is you didn't if we're not planning enough to know what our terminal objective is for our students, how the heck are they ever going to get there? How the heck are they ever going to walk away learning stuff from your class? And if they feel that they're not learning stuff, then your lessons are going to bomb. Even if it's a test prep kind of class where they need to feel like they're going to be doing better on whatever assessment items that they're going to be confronting when they're done with you. But those terminal objectives typically are about things, as you said, things students can do with things people can do with language, like whatever, inviting people or complaining or requesting politely instead of rudely, those sorts of things. And so now the key point here, the one I want to get to, is that means your students have to be talking. If they're going to be requesting, or if they're going to be able to request or complain or invite or describe or any of those things, they're going to have to be talking, or they're going to have to be writing communicatively. One of those two things. That's what we do with language, and that's how we do language. We do it by speaking or writing. Here, the point is about, in terms of why your lessons or why one's lessons might be bombing, is that if we're not planning enough to understand what we want our students to achieve at the end, if we're not planning enough to understand how we're going to get them to talk to each other, if we're not communicating and using functions enough in our classes to get them involved in the class, then we're probably dealing with your normal, typical teacher-centered. It's a teacher-controlled environment, and the quality of this conversation that I talked about at the outset is pretty poor. So maybe that's something that we can talk about. Very often in our classes now, in my classes now, I hear teachers talking. Dare I say, almost all the time. And often my question, when I have a chance to reflect with them, and trust me, you can tell by the way I'm talking here, I speak from what I know. My question is, why did you ask that question? Do you need the practice asking that question, or could you get your students to ask those questions to each other so that they can practice asking those questions? Time after time, that simple little question becomes an eye-opening moment for students, as if to say, when I ask that question, it sounds ridiculous and it sounds snotty and it sounds, perhaps really insulting, but it's a really basic point. And once we realize, hang on, there's a whole lot of what I say that I don't really need to be saying, and that this classroom conversation can be, the floor can be given to my students a whole lot more than I ever thought it could be, a whole lot more than I ever experienced it being given to me when I was a student. The only things we know are the things we've done. We know how to walk because we learned by falling over, by getting up, and so on. I mean, we all sucked at it when we were 2, but we're pretty good at it now. We didn't learn to walk by talking to our parents about it. We didn't learn to walk by magically standing up and doing it perfectly after watching a whole bunch of knees go by our eyes when we were infants. We learned to walk by stumbling around and bumping into things and being novices first and being really proficient later. But we learned by doing it. So here, if the teacher's doing all the talking, if the teacher's controlling all those questions, what did you get for number 1? What did you get for number 2? Who knows the correct answer? Can somebody tell me what this is? Then what are you going to get at the end of your course? Students are never going to be able to ask questions because they didn't ask any. They're never going to feel that they can. Connecting all this back to your point about not knowing the end result, if you're not going to let students do something communicative with language and get a response, then they're never going to learn to do that.
Nobody really likes listening to their own voice or watching themselves on video, but listening and transcribing your own classes is beneficial for this reason, right? Who is talking the most in class?
I'm glad you're thinking about that. Yeah, honestly, the single, if your listeners want one simple piece of advice, it would be to blue tack their smartphones to the wall of their classroom and turn them on and then go back and be brave enough to have a look at them later. And once they get over the shock of seeing themselves, because it is shocking to all of us.
It's not pleasant.
It's amazing, isn't it? How often we look in a mirror. It's different from watching yourself on film, isn't it? Right. None of us are the gods we think we are. Right. But once you've gotten brave enough to try writing down even just 3 or 4 minutes of the conversation of your classroom, then you can start to get into some of the most useful stuff I've ever seen. At least it's very useful for me. But I don't understand how it couldn't be incredibly useful for anybody. If you transcribe your own classroom discourse, the conversation that's going on between you and your students, you can look at it you can look at it and understand and start making observations about exactly how much of what you're saying helps students continue the conversation, and how much of what you're saying kills the conversation. I'm paraphrasing an idea by a TESOL scholar, a linguistic scholar named Steve Walsh. But the idea is that anything we say, anything teachers say, honestly, anything students say too, either blocks or constructs possibilities for ongoing conversation in your class. And if your class is, as most unaware, unreflected classrooms tend to be, if your class is unfortunately the garden variety class, chances are we're blocking opportunities for conversation far more than we are facilitating those. And what does that mean? That means you're preventing your students from learning, which is opposite to what you want to be doing in your class, I assume, right?
So if a teacher has transcribed even, let's say, 10 minutes of their class,
right,
what should they be looking for?
Okay, they can be, well, let's start with a basic distinction between two kinds of classroom talk. Teachers often feel their job is to, as we were modeling earlier, is to say, good, correct, very good, yes, yes, right, right. And of course, once we condition our students to the fact that we're going to answer like that, they're going to be talking in one-word utterances all the time. They're going to be saying, car, teacher, go, teacher, happy, teacher, no, yes, because. And you're going to be saying, yes, correct. And they're going to be training you to think that you're doing the right thing. And you're going to be training them to think that they're doing the right thing. And all you're really doing is checking answers all the way through. And nobody's speaking in realistic utterances, let alone complete sentences where they get the chance to repeat, where students get the chance to repeat subjects and verbs and objects and all that. They're just doing school. And they're going to find that, and if we teach our students, if that's how we help our students develop, in other words, we're not helping them communicate better, we're helping them do school better, then that's what they'll be able to do. They'll be able to do school better. But you can't expect them to walk out of your classroom and into the street or onto the internet and do English better, because they're not. So they can be you can be looking at evaluative, at the ratio of evaluative to communicative teacher talk. That's one thing. How much are you actually inquiring into your students' lives? You know, the example about I walked the dog, and what, do you have a dog? What kind of a dog?
Evaluative would be good. Oh, that was good. Oh, not quite right.
Yeah, judging the linguistic accuracy of your students' responses.
Yeah, purely at the accuracy level.
Right, as opposed to continuing the conversation that's been made possible by what your students said to you or to each other, right? So,
and it's interesting with you talk about obstructive teacher talk. Okay. I was surprised, like when I monitored classes, how often the student was kind of getting into a rhythm of they wanted to convey some information, but then because the teacher felt like they had to ask something,
right,
they would just interrupt and say something like, yeah, so anyway, I took my dog to the vet, and it would be like, oh, was it expensive? And they would just jump in, and that kind of threw the student because the student wanted to say something different. Yeah,
okay. So right, and this gets to the issue of power in the distribution of power in the classroom. In a normal conversation, the two people talking to each other are simultaneously, they're at the same time as they're exchanging information, they're also establishing who's who in the relationship, and they're almost subconsciously, not quite, but almost subconsciously, and certainly socio-linguistically, they're confirming and reconfirming that it's okay to talk to each other this way. Just like this, you just said, okay, I made eye contact with you. I'm the guy that's supposed to be doing a lot of the talking, but we're having a conversation here. It's a different kind of conversation than we would perhaps normally be having, a little bit different. But we're ratifying our identities to each other all the time here. Same thing happens in a classroom, only the problem is, culturally and historically, in almost every classroom culture in the world, the power dynamic of that's built into a classroom gives the teacher the floor all the time. And that means the default, and everybody knows it, is ultimately the conversation is going to go back to the teacher. And it's the teacher's role to own that conversation, to kill that conversation, and to keep things moving so that we can continue to do school. The irony is that in a language classroom, if we continue to do school, nobody's going to learn anything. You know, so the language teacher has to undo all of that cultural baggage that both he or she and the students bring into the classroom in order to make that talk a series of constructive opportunities for language proficiency development. We have to stop ourselves from continuing to control the questioning and the answering. We have to stop ourselves from judging our students' language output, except for those moments where we're focusing on accuracy. You know, we have to help our students understand that it's okay to actually to talk to teachers and to talk to each other, and that we really do care about those students, and that is ultimately the bottom line. Right. In any good in any high quality conversation, the two people conversing care about the outcome. So one, really big question we can ask our listeners and ourselves is, well, did your lesson bomb because you don't care about the lives of your students?
Right.
Because
who likes small talk?
Right.
Because the outcome is irrelevant. That's why it's small talk.
You've had that feeling, right? You've had that feeling and you've had that feeling that your students are always looking at you going, "Are you bullshitting me? Yeah. Why should I answer you? You don't give a damn.
Right.
What do you care about?
What did you do last weekend? What do you really care?"
Right. They need to care, and you need to care. The teachers need to care. That's probably the simplest way to guarantee that you have that the quality of your classroom conversation is conducive to language development, is that your students know that you care. Is that if you can feel and they can feel and they confirm that to you, that they buy your intention. It's not just to judge, but it's to care about them as human beings, to nurture them. That's really the key.
I guess another part of the power problem is, especially with meta language, that there is kind of a power of dropping in kind of, okay, well, we're doing the past participle right now. Right. And I remember learning German back in middle school.
Yeah.
And the teacher handing out a list of verb conjugations.
I remember the pluperfect in French.
Yeah, but
pluperfect.
It's called pluperfect in English. In England. And
yes, so you still.
I didn't know what that was in English.
Yeah. Right.
So it was basically a sheet of irrelevant information.
Yeah.
But the teacher knew what it was.
Yeah.
And he was trying his best, but we didn't learn anything. There was no learning happening.
Right. Teachers have to have the knowledge, but with great knowledge comes great responsibility, right? I think I was the first person who ever said that, whose nephew wasn't wearing a spider costume. Yeah, I think so. But we have to have the knowledge, the linguistic knowledge, but we also have to know when not to talk about it, and we don't need to. This is what it's just. I was about to say it's inexperience, but it's not, because you see teachers who've been teaching for 20 or 30 years, and Lord knows I probably am equally guilty of it. Even now, even though I'm so aware of it at the same time.
I find it slipping out.
It is the desire to reconfirm my excellence as a language expert and a teacher by talking about language or by controlling my conversations.
But I think another reason for using that kind of language is, especially in countries where they've grown up learning language as a grammar, that often teachers feel like it's a shortcut.
Yeah.
That you feel like you are speaking the same language if you say, well, actually, that's the past perfect progressive.
Yeah, absolutely.
It feels like a shortcut.
Oh yeah, no, and there is you as an artist of the conversation, you do have to have moments where you're studying language and clarifying rules and all that sort of. You can't go through a class. You can't go through a course without focusing on accuracy as well. Right, especially because a great number of our contexts, our teaching contexts, are test prep contexts, and
Right.
the tests themselves contain that terminology, and maybe not even in the L2, maybe in the L1.
Right.
But we do have to have that vocabulary. A lot of our students require that vocabulary in order to have any success on tests and exams. The trick is getting the balance right. If you're in a test prep context, as many of us are, do we need to settle for only preparing students for a test, or can our or is it more useful for our students to be developing their proficiency at the same time? Because we obviously most of our test prep classes, but the default would probably be more like the example you described at the beginning of our conversation, where we're not even planning a lesson, we're just working our way through a test prep book, for example. And it's hard to blame people for doing more, for not doing more than that, except that once you got the knowledge, there's another one, right? You got the power right? to orchestrate your classroom conversation so that you've got the power to orchestrate your classroom conversation so that not only are your students becoming better test takers, they're also becoming better language users. Right. If you know that, I'm all right. I want my students to, for example, I'm just improvising here, but all right, today this test prep unit is grammar about the present progressive. All right, we're gonna have to master that form. We're gonna have to be able to distinguish when it's right to use it and when not to use it. And that's how they'll do better on their test. But heck, if they're learning when it's right to use it, why not create a whole bunch of dreaming practice activities where we're imagining what our favorite people in the world are doing right now while we're stuck in the middle of this boring language class mastering the present progressive.
I think anybody who's been stuck teaching TOEIC or something like that probably prays for something to release them just from that slogging through the book.
Right. And this may be the third point about why your lessons bomb, and you've just opened the door to something. The third reason why our lessons fail is because we don't employ our imaginations. And I don't mean that, what would the word be, airy-fairily or something like that. I don't mean that.
Like a writing workshop.
Right. I mean it really constructively. Like I said earlier, the longer I do this, the happier I am to confirm that good teaching is an art, and art requires imagination, and it requires awareness of what's happening in your class. And the only way you can become more and more aware is to keep reading, keep trying, and keep reflecting, keep developing yourself independently of anything else, and keep garnering experience,
right,
and keep creating opportunities for yourself in the classroom and seizing those moments. So the imagination idea. That's about creating. It's about knowing that my students need to do something, and I'm the one who's got the world experience with the language, and I can, any moment I want to, I can seize something out of my mind and say, hey, let's do this. Imagine you're this, or pretend you're this, or what do you pull it out of the blue so that this language function becomes useful to our students.
And I think that is part of the art as well. Like, having seen some teachers who they lack the craft, but having watched some of their lessons, some of the ideas they brought into the class was like, you can't teach them to do that.
Yeah,
it's like,
beautiful, huh?
They'll get the craft later, but just how they've decided to explain something is a lot of times thinking, God, I wish I thought.
Yeah. Oh man.
Oh, that's good. I'm going to steal that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So those kind of teachers, they bring the ideas, and what they learn later is how to best set up that idea as a role play or as some kind of exercise. So that the actual skill of setting it up comes later, but just naturally having those great ideas, I think it really separates out those career teachers and those kind of by the book. They're not bad teachers, but they're just kind of very by the book, by the numbers.
You can't see what he's doing, but he's doing a lot of gesturing here right now and talking, and I can.
I'm voguing right in front
well,
of you.
there you go. But I was doing the same thing a few moments ago. But I think I think what he's getting at here, and I think what I'm hearing is these same, and maybe my imagination keyword there, and Andrew's follow up is also about I can see those people he's talking about communicating with students during the class, not delivering teacher talk, but communicating to get these things happening. That's really what we're going back to here is this quality of classroom conversation. It requires imagination to sustain the conversation. Because the construct is so artificial. Teachers and students, we're supposed to learn language, but we can't learn it unless we use language on the same level together. Right. The construct is so artificial. As I mentioned here, we really are, to do our jobs well. Language teachers have to undo most of the rules of school learning in order to have that conversation, and that requires constant imagination, constant awareness, and hang on, they're about to get back into school mode. Let me make sure we don't get there, and correct the flow of that conversation so it continues to be communicative and conversant. I mean, how unnatural is it to have a one-to-one conversation simultaneously with 16 or 20 or 30 people?
Right, yeah.
Right? It's hard work, and it's a skill, and it requires imagination. And I can tell you stories from this morning, from a morning class, about how wow, I can't believe I'm doing this, but I'm doing it. It worked again. I've got this conversation. I didn't plan to do that, but we're all having a conversation. They're talking to each other, and they're talking to me, you know? And I don't need to go into the detail, but it's that power, it's that skill, it's that kind of instinct makes me feel good about being a teacher, as opposed to the lessons, plenty of which I've blown, but that's the thing. It requires imagination. It's not a question of being awake enough or sharp enough. It's a kind of and I don't mean to say there's also a myth about language teachers having to be performers and actors. It's not that. We're not I'm not talking about entertaining my students, but it is a kind of performance art where you're controlling and monitoring, sustaining, like surfing a wave, sustaining the quality of the thing that's carrying you from the beginning to the end of your class.
I think it's the art of engagement.
There you go. Absolutely. While at the same time keeping your students conscious of the fact that they're learning. Exactly. I think it's absolutely fair to say it's the art of engagement. If you're talking to your wife or something, you're not worried about them learning a language. You're worried about just continuing communication and engaging. In a classroom, we're doing that plus helping our students remember that, and they are simultaneous, that this engagement is valuable to them, both on a personal level and on a language learning level.
Well, I think one maybe a top tip is I saw a kind of new teacher, and instead of doing the usual self-introduction at the beginning of the very first class, he had prepared 2 or 3 wallets that contained personal artifacts of his, like family photos, something like that.
Yep.
And he basically put them into 3 groups, handed out 1 wallet, and said, "Okay, from this, what can you learn about me?"
Lovely.
And so at the end of it, they knew where he was from, they knew about his family, and there was all kind of other clues in there. Things like, even like a receipt from a restaurant that he liked. And it was just a really sweet way to kind of edge in without just standing there giving facts.
I'm actually going to steal that. It's lovely to steal things. I'm going to steal that, but I'm going to tie it to something I often do. It's just struck me that you take the wallet and then you apply. Remember this question asking thing I talked about before? You can get them. You can tell them they're police, and they've found this at this, or it's been turned into them, and they're trying to identify the owner, and so they can talk about it for a bit, and then they need to fire back some questions, create some questions, and they can ask questions to each other, to the teacher, whatever, and that gives you not only the chance for students to learn something about the teacher, but actually to meaningfully engage in asking and answering questions. Because again, we always need to. It's just me being a developer here, but this idea of who needs the practice, the teacher or the students. Let's maximize the quality of the speaking that the students get to do. We could have them put together simple present statements like your name is Andrew Bailey, or you live in Shindorin, or wherever it is. But why not flip that? Say, are you Andrew Bailey? Where do you live? Do you live in Shindorin? This sort of thing. Flip the language, let them feel it's a little more cognitively challenging and all that, right? So anyway, I don't mean to ramble on, but that's great. I'm going to take the wallet thing. I'm going to do that next semester. That's what I'll be doing.
That's a free tip for everybody.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Appreciate the free tip. I knew I was getting something out of this conversation.
And it's especially good if you're a long-term teacher and you're sick of answering the same questions.
Or doing the same thing again and again. It's the imagination thing. How many different ways can I skin this cat? Yeah, right.
So another common problem is that at the end of the class, students don't feel like what they've learned is relevant or is necessary. It's like, why are we learning that?
Sure.
And I remember, again, going back to my German days, that the teacher was teaching 14-year-olds how to go to a gas station in German and ask for an oil change and full tank, please.
That one's hard to justify, I suppose.
And I remember how he justified it, because somebody said, "Well, sir, why are we learning this?" And he said, "Well, one day you might be driving through Germany on vacation." I was thinking, well, how many things need to fall into place for that to be the case?
Well, one thing is you need to go to communist Poland, for example. Then you'll find yourself driving through Germany on vacation. It might be East Germany, but still,
In a DeLorean, it sounds like.
in a what did they call those? What were those cars? I forget. I don't. Skoda was one of them. That was with the Czech cars. What was the Yugoslavian cars? Yugos?
The Lada.
How do you know this
Lada?
stuff? How do you know this, Andrew? Yes, I think it is a Lada. Yeah. Well, somebody can correct you. But
write in if you know. What was the Yugoslavian car in the 80s?
The communist Yugoslavian car. There was only one. Let's remember. Yeah. So that's a great point, and your German teacher failed, I think. I don't think too many people bought into that one, and it reminds me a great deal of my high school math instructors, several of whom I respected a lot, but I just kept thinking, the motivation for that was up to me because I was never going to use this in my life, right? But why do we care about the point here is, and I think the point you were getting at, Andrew, and it ties back to my little seemingly silly example about walking, but it's worth repeating because it takes a lot of time before people actually buy into this. I've had students write back 2 years later and tell me, wow, Tom, you say stuff sometimes it doesn't make sense until 2 years later, and one of those things might well be. So I'll just repeat it again. It's so profound. The only things we know are the things we have done, right? That means your students have to do things in class that they're going to do outside of class.
Is that your quote, by the way?
I don't remember if I stole it.
Sure. It was from Spider-Man.
You know how you tell a lie so often it becomes true? It was not from Spider-Man, I'll tell you that, yeah.
So one problem I had was that with the Berlitz textbook, opening a bank account, and for 98% of my students, the idea of opening a bank account in English was totally irrelevant. They weren't planning on moving abroad, and even if they did, their companies would probably open the bank account for them. So at the end of the class, there was just this kind of sighing and shrugging of what did we spend, an hour and 20 doing here.
Okay. All right. So I think we can go at that from 2 points. One point would be, if the teacher is not going to make the effort to exercise his or her imagination enough to change that task in the course, or maybe is constricted by the course syllabus and the institution, like Berlitz may well do, you must teach the opening the bank account lesson here. Must happen. Okay. Well, all right. Let's go with that example then. So the textbook includes a page of vocabulary and dialogue and a couple of visuals and so on that the students are supposed to put together and accurately reproduce a dialogue or a little scenario where they're opening a bank account in a Barclays Bank or something on St. John's Wood High Street or whatever. And their teacher has no choice about that. Fair enough. What the teacher does have a choice over, though, is helping the students understand what useful learning is going to happen here if they pay attention to it. This is why I'll go back to say the only things we know are the things we have done. Well, so let's ask ourselves, what goes into successfully and appropriately opening a bank account through a conversation with a bank manager? Well, theoretically at least, we need to be fairly polite about it. So there are going to be introductions, polite requests, polite responses. Now, ideally, we'd be able to remove that page from a book and replace it with something relevant to the context of our students. But because our institution restricts us from that, then we need to be thinking about the fact that our students are going to learn, are going to become better at making polite requests, at introducing themselves, at exchanging or delivering personal information, financial terminology, perhaps, times, constructs of time and things. That stuff may come in handy. They may not ever open a bank account in English, but they will be doing functional English that, unless you help them understand that as a teacher, they may not know they're doing.
Right.
They may say, "Oh, bank account's stupid," and they may completely disengage from your lesson.
But I guess it would be probably one of the more authentic ways of actually giving personal information, though. Like, where do you live? What is your name?
Yep.
What is your job?
Right. Now, I mean, if you do take that tangentially, if you are able to introduce another bit of fun into your class or something, maybe your teacher's imagination takes you to other cases, maybe not as realistic, in fact, but imaginarily.
Take that.
I'm going to make that word up and sign it and stick it in a dictionary one day. Imaginarily, just as useful, if not more so, for the classic, of course, is whatever role-playing police interviews where somebody's disappeared and you're describing the person or taking the details. And people love to play, and if we can create a sense of play in our classrooms, we can also learn by doing that way. You might actually be thinking, how does this? Why does pretending to be a police officer interviewing somebody about the disappearance of someone or a witness to a crime that they're describing? We were talking about exchanging personal information, describing people, and so on. How this relates to this idea of the only things we've done or the only things we know are what we've done. That's another reason why imagination is so powerful and why this sense of play is so necessary in a classroom. If we limit ourselves to only things we do in a classroom, obviously we're not going to learn anything useful that we can do outside of class. Right. If we take that idea of only knowing what we have already done in our lives, do we need to unpack that a little bit? The only things we know are what we have done. That means we're distinguishing between knowledge of something, intellectual knowledge, and the physical ability to do something. And language is actually not knowledge of something. It's integrated into our whole bodies and into our whole being. So we need to experience using language, doing different things, in order to be able to do different things with language. So learning by doing and allowing our students to do it. Let's tie this back to that sense of play. The way we can do that is by playing. And that means whether your students are children or adults, we need to create that classroom conversation with them so that they agree with us through conversation to play, to do things that they would not normally be caught dead doing. But what they're doing is they're using language in ways that will be very useful to them outside of the classroom, later.
And pretending to be a policeman outside of class has different ramifications.
Doesn't mean they're going to be a cop, but it might mean that they could ask somebody someday what somebody looked like.
Right.
Exactly.
I think another thing with students at the end of a class feeling like, why did I bother with this class, is that some teachers teach like it's the first time the students have heard this. Mm-hmm. Is it? And most students, I think it's fair to say, most students come to class with a certain experience already of teaching. So teaching...
Yeah, they're called false beginners. Beginners, yeah.
But even teaching present perfect as if it's the first time they've ever heard of this concept.
Yeah.
then again they feel like, okay, we've done this before and now we're gonna go through it again. So at the end they feel like, well, I didn't do anything new.
Right. Okay, so yes, what you can do so that they feel like they've done something new, what they probably, until they've come across a teacher who really knows what they're doing, you can attach the present perfect to something functional and purposeful. All right, I've done the drills. Yeah, I have done this. I have done the drills. What are we talking about there? We're talking about personal experience. We don't care when you did it. Have you done it? So let's tie that to a job interview. Where have you worked? Let's role play job interviews. Let's talk about our past experiences, accomplishments up to now. Just what have you done? We can attach those two functions. We can go back to your initial point about learning to teach, to plan backwards. What do I want my students to be able to do at the end of the lesson? Well, we're not teaching the present perfect today. We're learning how to sell ourselves in a job interview, for example. And
so
we do that.
Function over form in that sense.
Yes. Well, at least function married to form, because I'm willing to bet that most students don't get that. They don't get function married to form. They get form, or they get a native speaker who just does stuff with them communicatively, but doesn't help them improve their accuracy, So, right, we can talk, instead, if we take your idea of planning backwards, we can say, I want my students to be able to talk about their accomplishments. How are they going to do that? Well, when do we talk about our accomplishments? We talk about them when we're trying to get something from somebody. Well, what do we try to get from somebody? Well, if we're adults and professionals, maybe we're trying to get a new job or a raise. If we're children or teenagers, maybe we're trying to get more spending money from our parents. What do we talk about if we're teenagers trying to get more spending money? Well, we talk about how hard we have worked in school, or how,
as any typical teenager does,
as they try to make it look like they're doing anyway. Right?
They love talking about school achievements.
Right. Or they talk about how they've helped mom clean the house or whatever. Okay. But if we're adults, we're going to change that task, and if we're teaching adults, we're going to talk about how long you've worked at a company, how loyal you've been, how you've helped their bottom line. These sorts of things. All of that's present perfect. But we're doing it functionally, and we're able to plan this way because we're thinking about the end of the lesson, what we want our students to be able to do, because they have done it in class.
Right. And again, not treating it like it's the first time they've ever come across it. So on that note, Tom Randolph, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Boom.